It truly depresses me to see the video for one of my very favourite games broken. It really does. It's something that can't and won't stand. Flashback deserves more than a video with terrible unlistenable audio. It deserves a whole new look. And hell, I only really did the main game that time around. I barely looked at Fade to Black, and as for the remake, well, it wasn't even out yet. And so this time, well, there's going to be all that and more. It's an amazing game and a very European software story indeed. As we did in the first video though, we need to see some of the games that brought Flashback into being. Flashback is the standard bearer of the cinematic platformer genre, at least in 2D. It's certainly up there with the most famous of them and is, for a lot of people, the most complete game in the genre. Only one person can lay claim to being the genre's father though, and that is Jordan Mechner. But even before the game you'd most readily associate with him, you have to look at his first game, 1984's Karateka on the Apple II. A very well received if simplistic now fighting game that was praised, largely, for the fluidity of its movement. But even here you can see the cinematic inspiration. Mechner, being a student at the time, was mugging up highly on silent films, classic Disney, and the films of Akira Kurosawa. You see that Karateka uses screen wipes for its transitions? Not a Star Wars reference as you might expect, but a reference to the Seven Samurai, which used the same transitions all the time. And that influenced Star Wars, and so the cycle goes on. Making an all-out fighting game wasn't the whole point. Mechner wanted to create a story with a fighting game attached to it. For the game's movement, Mechner used the rotoscoping technique, drawing the sprites over images that he'd filmed of his karate instructor at work. Yeah, he was very much into almost everything Asian at the time, clearly. After 2 years of work, Mechner submitted Karateka to Broderbund, who liked it and published it. It would be ported to most every other computer in the years to come, celebrated highly, and a very big seller. Karateka is one of the first major examples of a video game taking heavy influence from cinema, and it is rightly a classic. For his second game, however, Mechner would keep the rotoscoping technique and transfer it to a platformer. The result? An even bigger success, Prince of Persia. Millions sold and found on literally every platform that plays games from then to today. This is the PC version. The silent movie influence seeps through big here, a setting and scenario that you could almost imagine Douglas Fairbanks or Rudolph Valentino taking top billing in. A continued exploration of techniques from Karateka, the sparse music and sound effects, born out of necessity on the Apple II, became a point of pride. No matter how much more advanced the platform would be, Prince of Persia just wouldn't feel right without a sparse, dynamic soundtrack. From a gameplay point of view, Prince of Persia was both the genesis of the cinematic platformer, and it also came close to perfecting it. For almost every example that follows, including Flashback, the core controls for movement and jumping are almost exactly the same as what Mechner designed in this game, and the same applies to the tight, grid-based steps when walking, the momentum when running, the weight of the jumps, the methodical nature of the combat, the pacing, and the level design. Prince of Persia did it all. The stories of how Mechner achieved his rotoscoping are legendary, filming himself and his friends climbing all over vandalised bus stops, dodging shards of glass in search of the perfect move and shot from which he could draw his sprites and create his animations. And yes, the building blocks of one of the most famous games ever made were based on something that in 2016 you'd likely end up seeing on Fail Army. Short of various additions here and there, the cinematic platformer will never move that far away from this game, from a pure gameplay perspective at least. These two games, even if he never released anything else, are enough to make Mechner one of the true legends of game design. But for now his work is done and the story switches to Europe, specifically France. Delphine Software International, or DSI, was formed in 1988 largely by two men, Paul de Senneville, a composer and producer who originally helped form the Delphine group that the studio spun up from. Originally a record label, the group was now expanding into other areas, including computer games. The other man was the company's lead director, a young and proud Frenchman by the name of Paul Cuisset. In 1989, this young company would add an equally young programmer, Eric Chahi, to their staff. He began by doing some graphics for Cuisset's impressive, if not particularly remembered these days, Future Wars, a point-and-click adventure game that was also built on rotoscoping techniques, courtesy of Delphine's in-house Cinematique engine. Delphine's aim was to create the most advanced story-driven games out there, and Chahi was fully on board with that. In fact, he had another project that for several years he had been working on entirely on his own that was heavily inspired by Prince of Persia, but, well, different. Presumably one day he just turned up to work and said, "Hey guys, look what I've been doing." Another World, or Out of This World if you were an American back then, is one of Europe's greatest triumphs in the history of gaming. Not only did it put Delphine on the map as one of the most advanced software houses around, it helped to put European coders as a whole on the map. I naturally talk a lot about European games on this channel, but a lot of the time the success of games on the ZX Spectrum and Amiga and what have you usually exist entirely in their homes, or in the Amiga's case its adopted home. Another World, however, was a worldwide hit, a truly special game, and one that made a lot of people take notice of just what was going on over here. What do I make of it as a game? Well, the presentation is truly staggering, like virtually nothing else that came before it. The introduction alone, where Lester Chaikin, almost an avatar for Eric himself, quietly sits coding and experimenting at his terminal before being sucked out of his dimension, is a staggering achievement. Gameplay-wise, I'm less of a fan. It very much leans on the cinematic side of the equation. No menus, straight into the game, which consists of a collection of set pieces where if you make even the slightest mistake, you're usually dead. It's almost as rigid in this regard as the likes of Dragon's Lair. Playing it for me can be, at times, really quite frustrating. Replaying scenes over and over is just an exercise in trying to get something exactly right, and in this instance it can become quite bitty. Still, immaculate presentation. I mean, what a marvel to look at. Once you've mastered it and can play it through, it's a wonderfully flowing experience that's still never gonna feel old. A game that's beautiful forever. It's just that getting there can be somewhat maddening a lot of the time. There were other cinematic platformers before Flashback, but these are the two core games which brought it into existence, not the least of the reasons being that the game would also be made by Delphine, a fact that led some people to erroneously claim that Flashback was a sequel to Another World. But Chahi had almost nothing to do with it. The man behind Flashback, undoubtedly inspired by his colleague's work, was Cuisset. Cuisset had been instrumental in the creation of the Cinematique engine, and that had been used in a couple of well-received but very challenging point-and-click adventures, the aforementioned Future Wars, Operation Stealth, which was released in the US with a James Bond license and dubbed the Stealth Affair, and Cruise for a Corpse. The games were very strong graphically, but didn't quite capture the market in the way that the top point-and-clickers did. Delphine had potential, but a long way to go if they were to match the likes of LucasArts and Sierra. Another World changed all that, however. After that game's release, Delphine would never make another point-and-click title. The focus switched to making more action-based games with high-quality graphics and a big cinematic touch. Chahi, the architect of this change, actually left Delphine soon after his signature game's release to form his own studio, Amazing, which would spend most of the next 7 years working on what would be in many ways the true follow-up to Another World, at least spiritually, Heart of Darkness. The Interplay-made direct sequel, Heart of the Alien from 1994, barely counts because, frankly, it's terrible. Anyway, without Chahi's involvement, it was up to Paul Cuisset to take the mantle. Flashback was born out of an obsession with cinema, of that there is no doubt, but it could have been so very different. The success of Another World gave them access to the creme de la creme of film licensors, The Godfather. US Gold, their main publisher and then holders of the rights to The Godfather, gave it to them on a plate. It was felt that only Delphine could provide the cinematic clout required for such a game. And indeed they did. But not in a way that US Gold liked. Cuisset's idea, straight away, was a new envisioning of The Godfather based on the concept of the Mafia existing in the future. The hero would have to escape from the Mafia in various situations, having pissed them off in some way. It sounds like quite the game, to be sure. But, as you can probably guess, US Gold were quite baffled at Cuisset's interpretation of a film based around gangster life in the middle of the 20th century. Delphine's Godfather was rejected immediately. But, regardless of that, they still had a game to work on. And so Delphine's Godfather gradually morphed into what would become Flashback. The Mafia instead became a race of alien shapeshifters called Morphs hell-bent on taking over the world, and the hero became a man, a government agent, who fell foul of the aliens just as he was about to discover their secret, and ended up having his memory wiped. He's not any kind of ubermensch, just a regularly built guy by the name of Conrad B. Hart. A lot of the surroundings that already existed in the Godfather license undoubtedly made it into Flashback, particularly what was in the Titan and Earth sections, and a new plot was built around it, involving various weird alien planets, a futuristic killing game show, and an overarching sense of not knowing who on earth you are. Flashback originally set foot on the Amiga in 1992, but it soon found itself on just about every platform going. It was clear that Delphine had done it again. You could make a few cases for a definitive version. One could point to the enhanced edition for Windows 95, featuring the best graphics and new FMV cutscenes, but for me the game is just amazing on a 16-bit console, with controls so natural and a spirit so unlike almost any other game you can find on the Mega Drive. It's pretty good on the SNES too, although there is a little bit of censorship there that naturally makes me gravitate towards the Mega Drive version that I have played and replayed for over 20 years. Honestly, I couldn't do any other version aside from this one. This was the game that people advertised as a CD-ROM game on a cartridge, complete with a comic by Marvel in the manual to explain the plot further, so important it was. And unlike a lot of advertising, Flashback could actually live up to a slogan like that, with cutscenes and sequences that you just didn't see on a console. Ever. Flashback's influences from the world of cinema are pretty clear, both major and minor. If I had to pick one thing that is a core influence, it would be Total Recall. The plot shares quite a lot of similarities with said movie, and there's even the odd line that's a direct reference. So it's hard to look past that film as the main influence. But that's not all, there are so many references. In my first review I compiled a bit of a list. I'd like to reiterate that now. Some of these may be accurate, others not, but it shows just how many things Flashback can remind you of, big and small. Jet bikes straight out of Akira in the intro. You could also point to New Washington as being another tribute, influenced by Akira's Neo Tokyo. Blade Runners, flying cars and cityscapes. The cyborgs are also very Blade Runner-esque and are even often referred to as replicants. There's quite a bit of Blade Runner here. The line "That's my head you're playing with," referencing
Be careful, it's my head too.
A planet blows up, Star Wars obviously. Continental zones in a city, 1984. A futuristic arena-based game show where failure results in death, The Running Man. Titan's mysterious jungle is heavily influenced by the work of Edgar Rice Burroughs, namely John Carter as drawn by Frank Frazetta, creating a jungle that's completely unfamiliar. I don't think I need to tell you who's responsible for the ubiquity of teleportation in sci-fi. The morphs themselves, traceable to Invasion of the Body Snatchers. You can point to Ellen Ripley for the suspended animation example, but Conrad's closest relative as far as sci-fi heroes go is probably Buck Rogers, who suffered a similar fate. Special glasses that can spot aliens? They live. And well, so many more probably. You could even point to the first shot of the game showing the characters running as a tribute to James Cameron, who often introduces characters feet first in his movies. You could theorise about Flashback and how much depth it owes to all of these things for ages, but one thing is clear, these guys loved film. You can almost imagine them having big debates, shouting at each other, waving copies of Kahiru's cinema around. Only a true film freak would think about reimagining The Godfather as a science fiction piece after all. And while it's in a much more conventional way, that love of cinema comes through pretty clearly in Flashback. The story itself is more of a classic Hollywood sci-fi romp than it is something more artsy like Another World. Very different, but most certainly exciting. Flashback as a game has a strange flow, but it's one that works out. The first level is pretty close to flawless. It gradually teaches you everything about the game, gives you a little bit of puzzling, has these incredible alien surroundings, and by the end of it, it's given you situations that'll make you feel smart. Throwing stones to distract the baddies and the like, carefully navigating the traps. It's great, and it never once feels like a blatant tutorial. The second level, in the underground city of New Washington, is odd. It's by far the longest level in the game, mostly because you have to do a bunch of jobs to earn credits in order to buy some fake papers. It does take a while, around an hour usually. It's also the home of Flashback's most infamous section. This jump right here. You meet the jump right at the start of the level, and if you were me, and indeed a lot of other folk, well, you just didn't know what to do. A running jump isn't high enough. What you have to do though is start a run, and then just let go of the D-pad, producing a ledge jump where Conrad automatically jumps and hands off a ledge. Don't you just feel silly? The ledge jump in many ways showed who read the manual and who didn't, as it's clearly in there, although it is an odd little movement. Once you do it though, you see how useful it is and you just do it constantly. For some, however, it's second only to the dreaded Carnival Night barrel in the world of perplexingly simple yet insurmountable obstacles on the Mega Drive. The rest of the level progresses smoothly. There's various situations, from searching for a rogue droid to clearing a restricted area out, to my favourite, the one to save a reactor from meltdown. This can be a real challenge the first couple of times through, but the atmosphere is awesome. The whole level itself is suitably grey, a dismal vision of a future underground on an alien planet that, again, owes a big debt to Total Recall with some 1984 thrown in. I get the feeling that a lot of this level, including the jobs, was here from the start when this game had the Godfather license, which might also explain why the level is way longer than any other, taking up an entire third of the game at the very least. Getting the papers earns you a spot in the third level, Death Tower, a simple action romp with subtly awesome graphics. It actually does feel like a game show of sorts. And lots of stop, drop and roll. It's the best way to deal with these cyborgs. Combat in Flashback is all about the right strategy, especially once you get the force field to block shots. You can learn just about every enemy pretty quickly aside from the ones at the end, and they're not difficult to pick up, although combinations can be a challenge. This sort of game always has trouble with combat, but Flashback is probably as good as it could be. Not amazing, but serviceable. The inclusion of rolling and the concept of manipulating levels does allow for a lot more variation. Winning Death Tower gets you a ticket to Earth, Blade Runner world, complete with flying taxis and everything. It's a breath of fresh air after the last two levels with a lot more colour to boot, but there's lots of alien cops after your blood. The level is split in half. Pre-brainwipe Conrad's findings led him to a nightclub called Paradise that contained a secret entrance to the aliens' base on Earth, and this dank surrounding provides the real challenge on the level. There's a lot of situations that require a lot of working out in order to avoid taking a hit, and you can only ever take 5 before you die. Energy generators are becoming ever more scarce, and dying takes you to the last time you saved, so it pays to abuse those save points whenever you can. The secret base is a serious challenge, complete with being chased by a fire trap at the end that'll kill you instantly if it catches you. Finally, Conrad lands on a grill and spies the aliens talking over their plans for domination, watching in horror, but he has one slight problem.
He's fat!
The grill can't support Conrad's weight, and he falls into the clutches of the aliens, who promptly chuck him into prison. After a panic start where you evade replicants while searching for your gun, the prison stage eases into a largely trap-focused level. Lots of dangerous situations, lots of instant death if you screw up. Orbs are the most annoying enemy here. They're easy when there's one of them and you've got distance, but when there's 3 and you're in a tight spot, you will not survive. It's not a long level by any stretch, but there will be problems. And finally you reach the teleporter that takes you to the last stage, the aliens' home planet. The last stage's setting is pretty great, almost what you'd think the inside of a xenomorph's brain would look like, even if I have to be honest and say that the alien planet is probably my least favourite level in the game. There are some right annoying leaps of faith that you wouldn't be able to figure out unless you die a lot or use a guide. And there are lots of morphs. Morphs are the game's toughest enemy. There is no good way to deal with them. They're faster, stronger, they're smart, and they can hunt in packs, or in tight spots. A morph can absolutely screw you if given the opportunity, and if you can, it's best to just evade them. One good way to do this is to use the teleporter that you got back in the prison. Another thing that right near the end of the game actually changes quite significantly the way that you play it, leaving your teleporter in spots where an energy generator is and so forth. And of course there's a final boss, the Master Brain, producing tons of morphs in a tight space. Can be quite a nasty fight. All that's left after that is to light the fuse, get on the escape ship, and leg it before the planet blows up. And when all's said and done, he sets the controls to cruise, gets in the cryo chamber, and goes off into a deep sleep. While there may be certain problems you could expect from a cinematic platformer, occasionally awkward combat, platforming and the like, Flashback minimises them as much as possible through some highly disciplined design. This game flows as much as a game like this can. The small additions to the traditional Prince of Persia controls like the walls and ledge jumps are game changers. And it is just so evocative and unlike anything else that you would find on a 16-bit console. You just weren't used to getting cutscenes like this, or playing games like this on a games machine. In having a look through all the levels, I hope that you can see for yourself just how far beyond Flashback was. And unlike so many games of this type that were seen to be more advanced than others, the animation and the goo-eyed shading of the characters has barely aged. You can still play games now that look a lot like Flashback. It's one of the most modern games you can find from the 16-bit era, and in all the best ways. A staggering achievement that absolutely anyone would struggle to top, Flashback made Delphine, for a short time, masters of the video gaming universe. This would not last long. Just before we finish with Flashback, here's some brief highlights from other versions of the game. It's not really worth going through all the versions as they are mostly pretty similar, but there are quirks. As mentioned, the SNES version has a bit of censorship thanks to Nintendo's standard policies. Not only was Death Tower renamed Cyber Tower, but the bar in level 2 is now a cafe. Honestly, it really looks like a cafe too. All those glasses, those people drinking out of them, the sullen barista leaning on the counter. It's a real smooth change. The original Amiga version has an odd feature, a zoom mode. There's several different options here, and while zoomed you can move the screen using the mouse. Apparently this was put in for combat and to help with finding objects, but honestly, it doesn't really work and was removed in all other versions except the PC version. Speaking of the PC, if you're looking for the prettiest way to play the game, then you might want to check out the Windows 95 CD version, which was touched up quite a bit compared to most other versions. It features other changes too. You get a new soundtrack, there's voice acting, and all of the cutscenes have been completely redone in proper video. They certainly look more expensive and all that, but really, yeah, give me the original cutscenes any day. They're a bit more charming. These video cutscenes also made it into the 3DO, CDI and Mega CD versions of the game. If you're interested in the PC version though, you can easily play it using Reminiscence, a fan-made STL re-implementation of the Flashback engine that lets the game run flawlessly on modern systems, although you will need the original files, obviously. So, Delphine had just made one of the greatest games of the 16-bit era, and they were on top of the world. Everyone was on tenterhooks wondering what the folks behind Another World and Flashback would do next. And I don't think anyone could have feasibly guessed what it would be. Another license. The license to create a game for one of the most popular b-ball players around. Delphine's eccentricities were laid bare. They, and Cuisset, followed Flashback with Shaq Fu. How on earth does such a thing happen? Mind you, I do have a pretty big soft spot for Shaq Fu. I don't think it's all that bad a game, it looks great and I love Shaq. Shaq probably loved it too. He's the sort of guy who looks at something made in his image and doesn't say, "Oh yes, me and my team think that this would be really good for my brand." Instead he says, "You want to make a movie where I'm a genie? That's awesome! Hell yeah!" And, well, it was popular, it sold well. But probably not as much as they thought it would, and it was roundly savaged and mocked. According to Delphine artist Thierry Levastre, a few bits of concept art were made for a sequel, but it was quickly cancelled. With a level head, Shaq Fu was at least an interesting failure. Delphine may have failed to make a good fighting game, but it still had some positives about it. It was also their last game of the 16-bit era. They chose to continue to be at the forefront of game design and switch to making 3D games for the PC and upcoming PS1. The first, from 1995, would continue the story of one Conrad B. Hart. He's cruised around the galaxy for 50 years, doing bugger all because he's in suspended animation. The good news for Conrad is that a ship has found him. The bad news is that the ship belongs to the Morphs, who immediately recognise him as the bastard who blew up their planet. Conrad soon finds himself paired up with the Mandragore Resistance, who help him to break out of a prison. In turn, he'll help with their struggle to beat the Morphs once and for all. Easy enough, right? I've been a bit sniffy about Fade to Black in the past, but I'd like to rectify that. I don't hate the game, although it has got quite a few problems. Fade to Black, as one of the first 3D platformers around, could certainly be considered quite groundbreaking. However, that doesn't really mean that it's all that fun to play. A lot of the controls are still there from the original game, but a few things aren't. You can't roll anymore, nor can you run and jump. As a result, the design has changed a lot. Not much platforming, more puzzles and action. The action parts are pretty straightforward, requiring you to just aim and shoot, and the puzzling action is probably the best bit. The platforming that's there is frankly diabolical, especially when you have to do it quickly. Jogging and jumping is a nightmare because the jump itself is just so unresponsive. This can make the game a serious challenge, but a lot of the time it's for the wrong reasons, like having to wrestle with the irritating controls. Of course, I'm not going to rip too much into Delphine for this. Again, it's one of the first 3D platformers ever, and obviously things were not going to be perfect immediately. Nor is it going to hold up that well in 2016. I mean, it's not Bubsy 3D, that's for damn sure. Despite the primitive looks and slow frame rate, the game does create an atmosphere, mainly thanks to the excellent dynamic soundtrack work. It's just that it can be annoying when, for example, you die, have to immediately wait a minute for a death scene video to load, then wait for the stage to load from the start, and only then can you reload your previous save. It's these little things that later games would iron out and streamline, but Fade to Black had to put the foundations up. In retrospect, it's a shame that Delphine didn't get to make Shaq Fu 2. I wonder if that might have put Fade to Black back a little, which then might have made it a better game if it had been, say, released in late 1996. Paul Cuisset himself has openly said that he wishes he could have done more with Fade to Black, and that the end result had been better. There's no doubt it could have been, but naturally being one of the first out of the gates resulted in some teething problems. As it was, the game was a hit on release, coming out for various platforms including PC and PS1, which you're seeing here, but better 3D platformers, Tomb Raider in particular, meant that the game fell back pretty quickly. An interesting formative title, but one that came out far too early in the 32-bit era to hold up for any length of time. And with that, the story of Conrad B. Hart goes dark. Paul Cuisset was keen to move on from it. There was a neat resolution at the end of Fade to Black that seemingly saw the Morphs beaten back once and for all, and one wonders if there would have been much space at all for Conrad in the 32-bit world, where one figure was dominating everything. The cinematic platformer, filled with adventure, was alive and well in 3D, and its heroine was Lara Croft. But of course, this story is far from over. We need to look at just what happened to Delphine, and the two attempts to bring Conrad back, the one that never materialised, and the one that a lot of people wished had never materialised. After Fade to Black, Delphine was still seemingly in a strong position. It was fairly successful, especially seeing as it was one of the first 3D action games out there, even if its time in the sun was going to be extremely brief. It is a funny quirk of history that around this time the cinematic platformer underwent a resurgence. Eric Chahy's Heart of Darkness finally came out, and while not a massive seller, it received good notices. But the real standard bearer in 2D was from America. The brilliant, quirky masterpiece that was Abe's Odyssey, a game that from start to finish is almost the equal of Flashback, and I wouldn't ever say that lightly. But if you look further, you see that the influence of the cinematic platformer was all over the shop. Tomb Raider, one of the biggest games of the 90s, was built on largely the same building blocks, only in 3D. It and various others would make the case for the 3D platformer going forward. Lara Croft on one side, the more traditional yet groundbreaking Mario 64 on the other. Paul Cuisset, meanwhile, had moved on. As patchy as you might consider his career to have been up to this point, his next major game, Moto Racer, was a big hit, and rightly so. It's possibly not held up so well today, but back in 1999 I loved Moto Racer. It was one of the most awesome things you could get on your PC. Fast, furious, motorcycling arcade action, what's not to love about it? There would be several Moto Racer games, and at first it seemed like they'd keep Delphine strong. Alas, it wasn't to be. Although the standard never dropped too much, each entry in the series was met with diminishing returns sales-wise. Plenty of other motorbike games followed in its wake, and they provided some pretty stiff competition. In 2002, Cuisset tried to go back to the well. His first reimagining of Flashback would be for the Game Boy Advance, titled Flashback Legends, set to be released under both Delphine and the company's offshoot label Adeline that they had recently revived, having laid dormant since the mid-90s. Flashback Legends is a strange game. With the limitations of the handheld in mind, it takes on a much more cartoony style, especially in the cutscenes. It's certainly very French indeed. In fact, it would be wrong to say that this is a reimagining of Flashback. Flashback Legends is a whole new game. It does feature characters from Fade to Black, so it is safe to assume that it takes place after that game, with Conrad now firmly established as the hero of the galaxy. Apparently there wasn't meant to be much of a plot, and the levels in this game are mission-based. Flashback Legends is also different in other ways. The game is suddenly a lot more colourful and cartoony, to the point where it does feel like this was set to be the Saturday morning kids TV version of Flashback. With that in mind, Conrad's Gurod shades straight out of the original look quite out of place, but there is a good reason for that. You see, this game was never released. What we have here is a beta, one that's probably not too far off from completion. A lot of the levels are in place, although some of them are still unfinished, but you can skip to the next one with a simple code. The added slowdown and flickering might give it away too. But the controls are largely the same as the original and adapted quite well for the GBA, and it's probably safe to assume that Conrad's sprite would have been replaced with something that fits more with the game's feel. It's rough, but an interesting little prototype. But it never came out. Why? Well, it's not a good story. With the hits drying up, Delphine found themselves pretty short of cash, and at the start of 2003 the Delphine Group sold their software company to the fairly obscure Doki Denki Studio, a company formed by members of the original Adeline. It's thought that sometime around here Flashback Legends was cancelled in favour of a new handheld Moto Racer Traffic, which would also never be released. Doki Denki Studio didn't have all that much money either, as it turned out. At the start of 2004, all of Delphine's programming staff were laid off. In March of 2004, Doki Denki Studio went bust, and finally, in July of 2004, Delphine Software International closed its doors for good, taking Adeline with it. As for Paul Cuisset, he would be out of the game completely for the next few years, briefly resurfacing for a rather obscure touchscreen-based DS game called Mr. Slime in 2008. But aside from that, no one heard anything. Until around 2011, when his return was announced. More than that, it would be a return at the head of a new studio, Vector Cell Games, producing titles for the latest platforms. Paul Cuisset was back, and surely that would make everybody happy. Their first title would be a survival horror cum escort game that Cuisset promised would be somewhat different from all the other survival horror games out there, and it would actually make escorting quite fun. And there would be all the story that you would expect from the man who'd headed up Flashback. 'Cause hey, that's who it is, isn't it? The return of an experienced hand like Cuisset harkens back to the days when studios and games were defined by the work of a single person, a warming sight in these times where thousand-strong faceless studio teams are the norm. Anyway, what was the game in question? Amy. Now, I never got the chance to play Amy. The reviews were too depressing for me to even entertain giving it a look. They were absolutely brutal. Every line another right hook to the head, whether it was complaining about the terrible level design, the torturous gameplay, the constant escorting, or a seemingly endless amount of bugs. Jim Sterling, reviewing the game for Destructoid, gave it 1.5 out of 10 and said it was one of the worst games ever made. And most of the other reviews, well, they weren't much better. The game was at or near the top of almost every list of 2012's worst games, and it has appeared on worst games ever lists since then. Amy was, apparently, a shocker. Paul Cuisset had returned and had laid a giant brown egg. It must be quite the demoralising experience. To come back and release a bad game is one thing, but to come back and release a game that's less lambasted? That's something else, surely. And the other side of having a name, as Cuisset does, is that every single problem with the game is going to be laid, personally, at your doorstep, no one else. If this were a video about Amy, or Cuisset himself, I would have downloaded it and seen just what the fuss was all about. But we must stick to the main task. It should surprise precisely no one what Vector Cell's second game would be. Despite Amy, Cuisset could still rely on that ace in the hole. Vector Cell wasn't just him. It was a big chunk of the team that had made Flashback, a selection of the best and brightest from the Delphine years. And of course, he had the rights to it. Flashback HD was announced in 2013 as a full reimagining of the original game made by people who had worked on Flashback and with Cuisset for years. Graphic artist Thierry Levastre, programmer and manager Benny Staron, and his wife Patricia. It would be part of Xbox Live's Summer of Arcade before moving to PlayStation Network and Steam, usually something that signified a big release on the download-only platforms. Now, I don't necessarily have anything against remakes, not even of things that I love, and the fact that the original people were involved could have been a big boost. However, Flashback HD misses the mark totally and ends up with something that I would find difficult to sell to anyone. The worries start as soon as you start controlling Conrad. There's barely any weight to the movement and jumps just feel so floaty. It doesn't feel like the finished article, especially when Conrad drops down a ledge and just seemingly hangs in midair. The game may move faster and it may not be flick screen anymore, but that doesn't necessarily make it better. The first level, once such a meticulous creation, is now a chore, a thoroughly modern tutorial stage complete with fetch quests. What was once subtle is now obvious. Cuisset made big noise about improving the combat. Now Conrad can aim his gun anywhere using the right stick. It sounds great! But one of the unique things about Flashback's combat, though it wasn't perfect, was the different levels, getting the drop on opponents and coaxing them into position so you could get distance, or using the roll features and whatever other bits of Conrad's movement you could to find it. By being able to aim anywhere, Flashback HD drops all of that completely. It controls just like any other modern side-view action adventure, only with the game's aforementioned jankiness. Combat was something of a puzzle in the original Flashback, one that required thought. Here, especially when you're constantly attacked by drones, it's at best a mindless exercise that constantly requires hammering the fire button against bullet sponges, and at worst it's a close to uncontrollable nightmare. In short, the combat is terrible. There are a lot of other improvements that are hardly welcome. Conrad B. Hart, as a hero, is now a poor man's Nathan Drake, with lame wisecracks aplenty. You know you're in trouble when the voice actor, bless him, can't even say awesome sauce properly.
Awesome sauce.
The addition of all this voice acting and exposition breaks the illusion. The plot hasn't changed much at all, but the original being relatively sparse allowed you to take this mishmash of sci-fi action films at face value, making it a brilliant whole. Told in the modern style, however, everything's just now very cheesy and it's hard to take the game seriously. There's also a typically unnecessary and unwelcome skill system, because government agent Conrad obviously has to level up all the time. Wait. This is sadly required by law in every game these days. No doubt if this game were released in 2015, there'd be a shoehorned in crafting system where I could customise my pistol or make a fucking blanket or whatever, because that's obviously what I want to be doing all the time in an action game. Some new elements like sneaking and grabbing people off ledges could have been interesting, but how often do you actually use them in game? It's always faster and easier to just shoot people. There's lots of assistance too, although a lot of it can at least be turned off. In terms of level design, Flashback HD does get it right sometimes. On the whole, it does look very nice, as you would expect a modern game to look. But the personality isn't quite there as it was before. If you take your mind back to the recent remake of Total Recall, that's what this is like. Beautiful and expensive looking, but soulless. The layouts are generally quite faithful to the originals, which isn't too bad a thing in some levels, and a bit of redesign here and there doesn't go amiss, especially in Death Tower. And there are times when the game does flow pretty okay, which is welcome, but then it all goes wrong again. There's too many things here that are just frustratingly shoddy, whether it's the aforementioned lousy movement or the constant, unnecessary slogging through combat and modernity. I don't mean to lay too much into this game, honestly. It breaks my heart. My feeling about Flashback HD is that while it's not a terrible, god-awful game, it's a very misguided and tragic one. Cuisset wanted his game to appeal to a whole new generation, but didn't approach it in the right way. Around this time, a lot of the other cinematic platformers got a new coat of paint. For the 25th anniversary of Another World, virtually everything was kept the same, only with HD graphics, widescreen and what have you. And that was hunky-dory, making that the definitive version of a classic. Abe's Odyssey was reimagined as Oddworld New and Tasty, showing one of the best ways to approach a well-loved game. The graphics are massively improved, there's a bit of playing with the camera, but the core of the game is never disturbed, and the result was very welcome. Flashback HD doesn't fit in with either of those. Too much of the game is ruined by changes that just weren't necessary, resulting in a game that wouldn't please anyone. While looking nice, the low budget movement would probably turn most modern gamers off, and those modern changes don't necessarily appeal to those familiar with the original. Sad to say, the best thing about Flashback HD is that it comes with a version of the original game. The result, alas, was inevitable. Flashback HD was not reviewed well, and did not sell well. VectorCell were all in on this title, and shortly after its failure, VectorCell disbanded, doing away with the final spirits of Delphine. In retrospect, I feel that they should have taken a different approach. While it's a worthy venture to try and bring a classic like Flashback to a new generation, it comes with a lot of risks, and as we can see, it didn't pay off. The approach that VectorCell took would have been much better served if, instead, they'd remade the sequel. A Fade to Black remake would have been unburdened by a classic reputation. That game has always been regarded as an ambitious one, but hamstrung by being such an early 3D title. Modernising that game would honestly have done it a world of good, I reckon. And perhaps Cuisset would have been able to do the justice to Flashback's sequel that he didn't think he did back in 1995. Of course, it's easy to say all of this now, isn't it? And so we are at the end of Flashback's journey, and of Cuisset's, for now. While I'm not sure if we will ever see another adventure with Conrad B. Hart, Cuisset is still kicking around. He formed a new studio, successfully raised Kickstarter funds for a sci-fi puzzle game called Subject 13, and released it soon after, to a good reception. He's still plugging away, and, at the least, he is still in control, and as patchy as his career might have been, he's still done enough to keep his reputation. If anyone can bring back Conrad, or at least the spirit of Conrad, it's probably still him. At the moment, however, Cuisset is working on bringing his other really successful game series back to life. Perhaps it would be best if the game, rather appropriately, remained stored away in people's memories. Because make no mistake, for anyone who played it, it'll be there forever. Bye for now! Many thanks as ever for watching this video on the story of Flashback. The next video is going to be an even bigger one, so stay tuned for the sneak announcement at the end. But first, if you liked this video, please consider subscribing, and also consider following me on all my assorted social media, which you can see right there. Anyway, it's on to the old thank yous, and we start as usual with the sinning ones. Martin Pataki, Taylor Armand, Mark Johnston, Twisted Squat, Andre Russell, Lee Norris, and Grayfen Blackpaw. Thank you so much for your awesome support. And of course, there's more. There's Mark Johnson, Tim Lintz, Robert Kelly, Tiago Pereira dos Santos Silva, James Ed, Mike Siegler, Mike Spooner, Ed Reader, Russell Hugo, Gerard Morris, Scott Coulter, Paolo Leary, Graham Kamak, Scott Mitten, Nicole Ketchum, Mark Brooks, Ninth Demon, Peter Sidorn, Ludwig Holmstrom, John Ezel, Kit Leary, El O'Brien, Dave Parkinson, Novel, and Olaf Olbein. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone else who has provided support and helped to make these videos possible. I should be back hopefully soon with the new video, and once again, it's gonna be big. But until then, I shall say as ever, wherever you are and whoever you be, have a good one, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.
I think I'm going to continue making those steps forward. This is my life, my passion. I don't think I'll ever stop. I don't think I would know what to do with my life without making games. It's a fantastic, amazing, incredible job. I get to have a dream and see that as reality. What else could you do?